Okay, everybody, welcome. Hope you can hear me. Give me the thumbs up if you hear me. If it's you're hearing, okay, thank you. Thanks. All right. This week's Parsha, let me put my phone on silent. First of all, thank you to our host, who is, by the miracle of modern technology, is actually in Rome and yet still helping us host this session. So thank you. And Va bene, we say in Italian. Well, this week's Parsha of Bo, you might not realize it, but when people ask, where do we see the announcement of the Exodus? This is the cataclysmic event in Jewish history, the Exodus. Where do you find that? Well, it's tucked into a little, barely seen, noticed pasuk in the middle of Parshat Bo. And it's without a great deal of fanfare, interestingly enough, which is a subject for another time, because we are obviously going to refer to Yetziat Mitzrayim many, many times and many ways, because it is the essential event in our history, in the history of the Jewish people. Maybe the history of the world is creation, but the history of the Jewish people really all focuses on the Exodus from Egypt. And it is here in Parshat Bo. So I want to discuss a very fascinating topic, expand a bit on it as well. How long were the Jewish people, were the Israelites in Egypt? And then talk a little bit about why were we there at all? So, like everything else, it's not clear. There seems to be a dispute, and we're going to take a look at some of the sources. So, in our parsha of this week, in the 12th chapter and the 40th verse, so the pasuk says, seems to be clear cut. Umoshav b'nei Israel asher yashvu b'Mitzrayim, the habitation of the b'nei Israel who were living in Mitzrayim, Egypt. How long was it? Shloshim shana v'arba shana, 430 years. And the next pasuk, then repeats this number for emphasis and says, Vayhi miket shloshim shana v'arba shana. It was at the end of 430 years. And Vayhi be'etzem hayom hazeh, on that exact date, we'll talk about that exact date in a moment. Yatzu kol tzivot Hashem eretz Mitzrayim. That is the day that we left Egypt. 430 years. It seems pretty clear. And then we say, as a result, that event, Leil Shimurim Hu Lashem, it's going to be a night of guarding. It's a special evening that, of course, is the Seder night. To remember when we left Egypt on that night and we were protected. It was a glorious moment. And okay, that seems to be the essential opinion. However, not so simple, because we have another um, pasuk, another reference in the Torah that says something different. All the way back in Parshat Lech Lecha, in Bereshit, in the 15th parak, the 12th verse, and there we were talking about. We were, of course, at that time now dealing with Abraham, and the pasuk tells us that the sun goes down and there is a burning flame and a torch going back and forth, and God appears to Abraham and he makes this covenant, this promise. Karat Hashem et Abraham brit lemor, and he says, I'm going to give your children the land of Israel from the Nile to the Euphrates. And then the pasuk goes on to tell and quote a very different number that we from what we had before. And Abraham is told that although this is a positive promise, God says, know for sure your descendants will be foreigners in a land not theirs, and they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. And a little bit more. The fourth generation will ultimately come back, for the sin of the Amorites will not be complete until then, that we could not occupy Israel, come back and take control of Israel, because it was being inhabited by the Amorites, and they had a certain right to it until they lost that right. But here we see very definitively the number of 400 years is given, not 430, but 400. You know that the Torah is always very precise. So which is it? Were we in Egypt for 400 years or for 430 years? Well, Rashi comes along and wants to clear this up by making it even more murky. And he says, it's not either one of those. It's not 400, it's not 430, but it is, what does he say? That it actually is 210 years. Well, we're going to have to try to figure out now who's correct. Let's give a little background to the story in terms of the math and the numbers. Levi, who was who was the first of the brothers actually to die in Egypt, but he will give, I'm sorry, he's the last of the brothers. Yosef was the first. Levi was the last of the brothers to die in Egypt. He gives birth to Kahat, who lives 133 years. He gives birth to Amram, who lives 137 years. And he gives birth to Moshe, who is 80 years old when he redeems Israel and leads us out in the Exodus. So if you want to suggest they were in Egypt for 400 years, this can't be so, because the total of all those numbers between Kahat and Amram and Moshe, you only come out with a total of 350. And you still must subtract from that all the years that Kahat lived after Amram's birth and Amram lived after Moshe's birth. So in other words, if you do the math, we could not have been in Egypt for 400 years. And it's much closer to 200 years. So what do we do with these predictions, these statements in the Torah about 400 years and 430 years? What do they refer to? So the Ramban comes in. He also is grappling with these numbers. And he says as follows: 400 years, that time clock begins with the birth of Yitzchak. Yitzchak is born on the 15th of Nisan, by the way, which is Pesach. And interestingly enough, that is exactly, of course, when the exile ends and the Exodus begins. We'll come back to that a little bit later. So, says the Ramban, there was a clock ticking 400 years, and had we been worthy, then we would have left after 400 years, dating back from the time of Abraham. But it was only after 430 years that we did leave, because, well, we did not conduct ourselves appropriately. And so there was a penalty added to those 400 years that were told to Abraham. And the Ramban chooses or sees from this idea that we do affect time, and the way that we conduct ourselves is going to make a difference even in predictions that are in the Torah. You see another example of that, and therefore, says the Ramban, the Jews were in Egypt for a total of 240 years. Now, we'll see for a moment that others completely argue with that, but that's where he comes up, the number he comes up with. But we see, for example, that these numbers are not hard and fast. For example, Yosef has this dream, or he interprets the dream of Paro, that there's going to be a famine for 7 years. There'll be good crops, good plenty for 7 years, and a famine for 7 years, 14 altogether. But that's not what happens. There is indeed 7 years of plenty, but instead of 7 years of famine, only 2. So it comes out to be 9 years instead of 14. Things change, because in this case, Yaakov comes to Egypt, he gives a blessing, and the famine ends after only 2 years. So says the Ramban, the numbers can be moved around depending upon our behavior. But Rashi, he tries to reconcile all of this, and he says, okay, the 400 years is the time from the birth of Yitzchak until Israel left Egypt. Because he says Yitzchak was 60 years old when Yaakov was born. And when Yaakov descended to Egypt, Yaakov makes a statement and says, the years of my uh, sojourning are 130 years. So now you have 190. And Rashi adds, the Jews were in Egypt for 210 years, with the word redu, resh, dal, and vav, going down. He learns it from that verse. And he says, therefore, we've got a total now of 400 years. He says that the number begins from the time that Abraham had a child, and then he can fulfill this prophecy from your descendant will be a strange, for your descendants will be strangers. As far as the 430 years, he says 30 years passed from the time where there is this famous Brit Bein HaTarim, the covenant between the pieces, and that was decreed only from the time of the birth of Yitzchak. So he says, well, you can play with all these numbers. 400 years start with Yitzchak's birth. 430 years start a little bit earlier with this covenant of the Brit Bein HaBetarim, where Abraham is informed that there will be not only nationhood, but exile, then redemption, etc. So in a sense, it could start earlier there as well. But in reality, although we toss around these numbers, says Rashi, the Jews physically were only in Egypt for 210 years. Where does Rashi come up with this? He quotes a couple of midrashim, and the truth is, in effect, you can use all three figures, 430, 400, and 210, because the 210, while we were not in Egypt for all those years, 430, those were times when we were told you will be living there, you will go into exile. The actual exile only is 210 years. And by the way, and I'll come to this in a moment, how long we actually were in slavery. In Egypt, 210 years, but not in slavery for 210 years. Let's kind of take a little bit of a turn here. Instead of talking about what it was, when it was, let's talk about why it was. Why did all this happen? Why were we told early on we'd have to be in this exile? Abraham, long before it would be his great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren who would actually go into slavery in Egypt. Why did all this happen to us? Why was God telling us right from the very beginning that we were going to have to go through this terrible trauma of exile from our land, living away in Egypt, being in slavery, and ultimately being extricated from it? So it starts with Abraham. And the Gemara says, okay, let's see, why did Abraham deserve that such a thing would happen to him and to his descendants? So there are four reasons that are given. One is three of them about Abraham, that Abraham, we're told, when he went to battle, he took scholars, and this is so interesting with what's happening today in Israel. And indeed, this is a source that that much of the Haredi world uh, comments upon and uses as a rationalization, that Abraham pressed scholars to go into military service, and as a result of that, says Rav Elazar, therefore he was punished. He shouldn't have done that. Shmuel says, no, it was because he tested the promises of Hashem. And he said, Bameh Edah, where and how shall I know that indeed we, our descendants, will inherit the land of Israel? He should have trusted God when God told him so. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, it's that's not why Abraham, in a sense, was punished. It's because in the story of the battle of the four kings and the five kings, so Abraham says he prevented those people, says Rav Yochanan, from entering beneath the wings of the Shekhinah. He says, "Give me the persons, take the goods to yourself," but in the end, says Rabbi Yochanan, he didn't conduct himself appropriately, and therefore he was punished. And the fourth reason that's given, something that I think we're all pretty much aware of, is the sin of selling Yosef into slavery. That is what triggered and caused the servitude in Egypt to take place. Those four errors, let's say, by great people who should not have made those errors. Indeed, when we talk about now how long actually were we in slavery? Okay, Rashi says 210 years in Egypt, but how long, how much of that time we spent in slavery? So there are many different opinions, but the opinion I think is the most credible is that if we take the based upon nine brothers who sold Yosef into slavery, nine of the 12. Of course, Benjamin didn't, and Yosef's one of the 12, and Reuven was away, he wasn't there. So there were nine brothers who threw Yosef into the pit. Yosef ended up spending 13 years in prison in Egypt. 9 times 13 is 117, and says this opinion, that's how long we were in slavery in Egypt out of the 210 years. The rest of that time, we were in Goshen. We had a cushy, privileged life, but unfortunately, it did not last very long. And we spent a little bit more than a century, 117 years in slavery. So when we look at uh, this side of the equation, the common denominator is that our exile is a punishment. Abraham didn't do the right thing. The brothers didn't do the right thing, and then we were punished for that. But the question is, because and this is asked then and now, because one person sins, everybody else should suffer. So Abraham didn't do the right thing, or Yosef or his brothers, but why did everybody have to suffer? The whole nation go into slavery. So the Maharal points out that maybe we're looking at this the wrong way. Certainly one way to look at it is a punishment, but maybe it's not necessarily a punishment. Maybe the goal here is not to oppress or punish us. Maybe the goal is to do a tikkun, a redress, or a rehabilitation or refinement of our character. And here we are given four opinions, kind of matching the other four that describe or try to suggest punishment. And here we have four other opinions why it was necessary for our survival as a people to go into slavery. So one opinion is, and the Torah tells us this, that our time in Egypt was a kur harbarzel. It was a kind of um, forging fire, something that was going to forge us into a nation, a crucible that uh, was something that we needed to survive. It's a kind of a process of purity when we, for example, tempering steel, you subject it to fire so that ultimately it will be stronger. It's painful, but at the end of the day, it's something that we needed to survive all of the trials and tribulations of history. So, after going through Egypt and being able to come out of that as a nation, now we would be able to survive any and every catastrophe and difficult time for the rest of our history. That's one opinion. Another opinion is that we were indeed a holy nation, and we were living this privileged life. But one of the things perhaps that we lacked was humility. that we needed a dose of humility to tell us that maybe we're not so perfect. Maybe we need to consider the way we're acting, and we had to be taken down a peg. The Gemara says, interestingly enough, although we think that the most honorable, noble occupation of someone could be a shepherd. And we think of David HaMelech was a shepherd and Moshe was a shepherd. But Chazal tell us, no, it's quite the opposite, that being a shepherd was the lowliest of occupations, to have to take care of the animals and clean up after them and sometimes sleep with the animals. And therefore, we're told that to give humility to those who later on would become high and mighty, they had to serve first as a shepherd, so that if they ever acted too proud, too arrogant, that you can say to them, who are you? You once were a lowly shepherd, and now you think that you're great and you always were great. So therefore, it's a training ground so that we learned humility. So that's a second reason. A third is that it was important that we developed or redeveloped the sense of unity. So especially after what happened with Yosef and his brothers, we needed to go through this period of slavery to learn that we have to depend on ourselves. We have to band together. We have to really, literally be a band of brothers and of sisters. And that is something that we learned the hard way in slavery. And we're told that we ultimately took care of one another. We did not inform one on the other. And we emerged there with this commonality, this sympathy and empathy one for the other, because we all went through this thing together. And therefore, the goal was to create that sense of unity. The truth is, of course, if we want to be honest, this still is clearly a tremendous challenge for us to be able to have this sense of unity here in Israel today, and understand that it's only when we are together that we're going to achieve the glory that God promises us. There's another possible approach to this as well, as to why we went through the difficulty of more than a century of slavery. And I've talked about this before, but it is what we call the pressure cooker uh, theory of history, that when we sin, God is very patient. And he doesn't punish us right away, and the sins build up and they build up and they build up like in a pressure cooker until ultimately it has to explode. And here too, we had done so many things wrong that had gone uncorrected, that we needed some event that was going to, in a sense, blow the lid off the pressure cooker, so that the sins would finally be expiated and atoned for, and we could move on. And there is that suggestion that this is what happened here also, that we needed that time in order to kind of clear out the negativity that we and all the mistakes we had made, so that we can, in a sense, start over. And all of these tell us that not so much a sense of punishment, but a sense of opportunity, and we might say even privilege, that we now were able to correct and somehow modify our behavior, so that we could go on to become this great nation for the rest of history. There's even an opinion that says, when we talk about dating, the the idea of exile, that it goes back to the beginning of time, that this was always part of a divine plan. Why, for example, did Hashem create a world outside the Garden of Eden if Adam and Eve were not destined to have to leave that garden? And therefore, when they do leave, so it's part of a plan, and it's something that is needed in order, as we said, uh, like with the Kur HaBarzel, in order to mold us into who we need to be. And therefore, uh, we said in the very beginning, there's at least a midrash that says this great darkness falls upon Abraham, and it quotes there different words. It says there will be a dread, says the Medrash, this is the exile of Babylonia, and darkness is the exile of Persia, and it will be a great exile. This is Greece, and then there will be Rome. So all of this, in a sense, kind of put into the mix right from the very beginning. So, in a sense, there are two ways to look at this exile and period in Egypt that we spent. One is to say, well, it was a punishment. We did the wrong things. We needed to expiate those sins to make up for the mistakes that we had made. But the other way to look at it, is, as we said, is a kind of crucible that yes, we did have to suffer, but the result of that ultimately was that it gave us greater strength and it allowed us to move on and ultimately to form this great nation. Um, so you have a certain dichotomy. Abraham is told right at the beginning there's going to be an exile, but he also understands that it's going to involve some kind of a tikkun. And um, uh, then he's told only when Yitzchak is born will the exile begin. Now, what did Yitzchak do wrong? He didn't do anything wrong. But nevertheless, it's teaching us that as we go through history, everybody is playing a role, and uh, we have to follow this kind of divine plan. Certainly, if we don't behave ourselves, that events will transpire that will train us and force us into becoming that holy nation. And I think in conclusion, I would say this is really true about not only the events of Mitzrayim and what we went through during that period of slavery. It's true about our life, and we do, especially living in Israel. We do encounter a tremendous amount of tension, of up and down life that involves great achievements and great miracles, but also great challenges and fear and problems that we have to solve. And we have to understand that we are being molded into a nation as well. We're in the age, if we're not exactly in what we call Moshiach Zeit, we certainly are the footsteps of Moshiach. We certainly are in that pre-Moshiach stage, and therefore the things that happen to us that we may look at individually, independently, as being great tragedies, and some of them are very tragic. But at the end of the day, it's all designed to bring us to a greater conclusion. I wrote this article uh, about, if some of you saw my Jerusalem Post article of last week, and talking about how we have to consider ourselves fortunate in that we are the generation living in Israel. And people wrote and said why Israel can be so much more dangerous than living in the diaspora. And it's true that we have suffered a great deal more. More Jews have died since Israel was founded as a state than in all the Jewish communities around the world. That may be true, and that's very tragic. But this is also part of the building process in order to uh, establish ourselves back in Israel and set the stage for what we believe will be the great redemption that will ultimately result in the entire Jewish world coming together here in Israel. And that is certainly not a simple task. And as a result of this being such a hard and challenging enterprise, that we're going to suffer a lot of bumps in the road along the way, some of them particularly painful, but ultimately the sum total will be that we have brought history to where Hashem wants it to be and helped to achieve that great goal that will come, we hope, Bimheri V'Yameinu, soon in our day. I'm going to close with the prayer for our holy soldiers. Mishaberach Abotenu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov v'Yivarech et Chayalei Tzva Hagana Yisrael Homdim al Mishmar Tzenu Varei Eloheinu Migvul Lebanon Ad Bimar Mitzrayim Min Hayam HaGadol Ad Levo HaRava Be'Yabasha Ba'aviru Vayam Yitein Adonai Davenu Akamim Aleinu Nigafim Livnehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yishmor v'Yatzil et Chayaleinu Mikol Tzra v'Tzukah Mikol Negu Machala V'Yishlach Bracha V'Atzlacha B'Chol Masei Dehem Yad Ber Sonenu Taktihem V'Yatrein B'Chet Yeshua B'Ter Nitzachon Vikuyam Behem Hakatuv Ki Adonai Elohechem Olechem Lachem Lilachem Lechem Imavechem Lasherchem V'Nomar Amen. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. Arrivederci to our host, who will be back next week with us, Bezrat Hashem, in Israel next week, same time, same place. Be safe. B'sarot tovot. Shabbat shalom to everybody.